there is an element in the room, right, which is the role of popular culture and what people describe as kind of the domination or in political debates about the African world, if there is such a thing, the United States and the debates within the US become really decisive in determining how people talk about politics. And I would even suggest like how, well, social movements develop organically, but there's a way in which these social movements, I think, are often in conversation with and gets influenced heavily by the terminology, by thinking about what is politically possible, or even in terms of like what are we building on? I think a lot of it draws on the influence of the American world. So can you say a little bit about that? Because I think we're speaking here a lot about what's happening in the university, but we recognize, of course, that, and I think Annie was mentioning, Fees Must Fall, right? Or End SARS, or Tahrir Square, or what happened in Tunisia. Like there are real political movements that are happening on the continent, and as I'm trying to suggest, Black Lives Matter is if you look in the last summer, it is probably the most decisive political movement globally. If you think of people of African descent, or if you want the African world, like how can you get at that? Like how would you respond to that kind of problematic?
I think that it's not new to kind of think of the struggles that are happening in the imperial cause, specifically of African Americans, as a vanguard struggle. That's not new. I think what is new is the requirement that the movements that are happening across the global periphery are legible within the frameworks offered by North America. Well, that's my little one getting him. And so I think there's a way we do this false internationalism of assuming if we talk about Black Lives Matter, if we talk about what's happening in the imperial core, then we are being internationalists. But, the level of political education that we were looking at in the 60s and 70s wasn't simply about knowing our own context. Black Panthers could tell you about the struggles that were happening in Congo, could tell you about the struggle of the Mozambican people, could tell you about the struggle of the Angolan people, right? Today, we don't have that. Today, we only get glimpses through social media of what resistance there is left on the continent, right? And that's awful. I don't know how we confront that, because that's such a huge challenge, right? And so I don't want to speak for too long, but I definitely think that part of the frame is, one, we haven't fully accounted for, if we're talking about like a world system which is structured in a particular way, then the political economy of the US Academy has to have a role to play in terms of like our ability to understand why these frames get exported to the continent. The political economy of like Black culture, in which centers and focuses on the Black American context, has to be taken into account. And none of these things are a moral critique. None of these things are by the design of African American scholars or African American activists or organizers. These are broader social forces which are being brought to bear on what is intelligible to us and what isn't. I'll leave it there.
I mean, I'm definitely in agreement with Annie here. I think the sort of influence, especially the way certain things become, a kind of aesthetic motif, and it gets, transferred that way. I think that can be a problem, but I think it's not really a massive problem if we actually have organizations on the ground. It becomes a massive problem when, all that exists is Twitter discourse. Then it's a problem. Then you have to really, worry, and you sort of inflate something that shouldn't really become a problem, and you have this sort of reaction against it. But I think we can't really forget the importance of building on-the-ground organizations, because again, to go back to the points we're making about, transmission of skills, transmission of memory, this is where this stuff happens. And I think, you know, people think of this as sort of like an old-fashioned party approach, but it's really I still think it's very much relevant as a repository of sort of social knowledge and historical understanding. I think we really need these forms. Yeah, so I'll just stop there. I don't think I have more to add on that.
I think, yeah, thank you to both of you. That was, you know, that was brilliant. I think this is a good time to conclude the show. You know, for my part, it just seems like, you know, this work that we're describing for ourselves that still needs to come of understanding exactly the nature of the social forces we're reckoning with, how our social world is produced and how that in turn produces us. It just always feels like, you know, at some point we need to have the serious debate about whether or not the left needs to log off, because truly, you know, social media just feels like such a toxic and distracting thing. And of course, now I'm individualizing the problem and expecting that there's going to be this mass exit that one can coordinate. But I do think that, you know, this return to the ground, the return to the roots, the ignoring of all of the noise.
If it doesn't happen on Twitter, then it didn't happen.
It didn't happen, exactly. And we need to know that. We need to know. I mean, that seems to be the, you know, the framework we operate under. But I mean, this is just to say, I think you're all absolutely right in the sense that we just need to, ignore the noise and get on with the work we know that we need to do.